Hello, welcome back to the Life from Nurse podcast. Hope you are doing well. We're moving quickly into December, so there's going to be a ton of auctions at all the big auction houses. Super excited for all of that. This weekend, I actually watched the Antiquorum watch auction that took place, which was super fun. Next week, I'm going to cover all the big auction houses and the auctions that they're going to be hosting. But what I wanted to talk about today was a trend that I've noticed, and you probably already know about this, but I thought it was worth getting on the podcast and talking about this. And that is how color has such an influence on the buying habits and preferences of collectors. Specifically, what I'm referring to is the buying habits of Rolex collectors, and how color really has a huge impact in the desirability of many of their watches. The reason why this came up was I was kind of prepping for next week's podcast, and I was looking at the Christie's Important Watches auction, and the first three lots are three colorful Rolexes. You have a Rolex 16610 LV, nicknamed the Kermit, which has a green, sort of like a light green bezel. You then have lot number 2, which is a Rolex Hulk 116610 LV with a green bezel and dial, or bezel insert and dial. And then your third lot is the Rolex 116619 LB, which is nicknamed the Smurf, which is, I believe, white gold and blue bezel insert, blue dial. If you keep scrolling through this auction, you have some other very interesting Rolexes with interesting dials. You have the reference 228239 day date with a green dial and Roman numerals. You have the platinum day date with a smooth bezel that has the sort of platinum blue dial. There's also the Rolex Daytona 116506 Daytona with a similar dial. I think I also saw a pretty interesting Rolex with a Rolex Daytona with a green dial. There was the John Mayer Rolex Daytona with a green dial, the 116508, which is in yellow gold with a green dial. So, these watches are popping up at auction because I think there is a lot of desirability with them. And I think what we've noticed over the last many years is these watches with this pop of color are selling, trading, however you want to describe it, at a lot more than what their retail value is. Now, Rolex is a brand that really sticks with its successful design elements that it has. The Rolex Submariners change very, 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 very. There are small iterations that are made to the Submariner and the Daytona. And the date just and the day dates and they're very small iterations that they make, but the overall design aesthetic of these pieces are very similar. And what you'll notice is these pieces are typically in fairly straightforward colors. There's nothing too ostentatious about all of them, unless you're looking at something like the Rainbow Daytonas, which of course is going to have a ton of color. But then again, that's another great example of something that's super desirable by collectors. Now, they're not the only brand that sticks with their guns when it comes to the designs of their pieces. Omega does the same. Patek Philippe does the same. There's many brands that stick with similar design aesthetics of their pieces, and it makes sense, right? You've got a winning formula, you might as well stick with it. But what I think is interesting about Rolex is it's so hard to get these pieces, and so if you have these watches with this pop of color, they become very, very, they become the next hot thing. And so I think the Hulk, the Kermit, the Smurf are good examples of it. The Rolex Daytona with the green dial that I mentioned, that John Mayer mentioned on the Talking Watches on Hodinkee, is a great example of it. But I think another great example of this, and we've covered it on our website, so I'll put a link in the show notes of this podcast so you can see our coverage of it, was the Oyster Perpetuals that were released by Rolex back in 2020, I believe. The reference that I'm referring to is the 114300. I meant the 124300, which was released in 2020. And this was where Rolex released a 41 millimeter Oyster Perpetual that was inspired by the Stella dials of the Rolex Date Justin Day Dates auction or many of the pieces that Rolex had produced with those really interesting dial colors, and they released a coral red, candy pink, turquoise, blue, green, and yellow dial oyster perpetual with really stark colors on them. These flew off the shelves onto collectors' wrists, and the amount that these watches were selling for was well over the, I believe, $5,800 US dollar price tag that was assigned to them at retail. But I think there are some other references that used a similar concept of employing color instead of just going with black and white dials or very simplistic color combinations, where they actually were able, Rolex has produced watches that might be flying under the radar just a little bit. And one of the watches that I wanted to talk about was actually in the Oyster Perpetual line, and it came before these Stella dial watches. Now, I am not recommending that you, put all your hard-earned money into these watches because you think that they're going to appreciate in value. But I do think that there is some potential for these watches to get more recognition for their use of color. And how they're a little bit different than your typical oyster perpetuals that perhaps you see on people's wrists. So the reference that I wanted to talk about was the one that the reference that I mentioned previously, which was the 114300. This reference was released in 2015 when Rolex was reimagining their Oyster Perpetual line, and the watches are very simple. They have hours, minutes, and center seconds. Hands, you've got a twin lock screw down crown, oyster bracelet with oyster clasp fasteners, chromolite for lume. These are your very simplistic oyster perpetuals that really is kind of like an entry into collecting Rolex. And they released a couple of dial variations, which I think was really cool. They didn't actually start off with releasing your classic white and classic black dial oyster perpetuals. I think they actually had a little bit of fun with these. They released oyster perpetual 39s with a silver, so it was kind of like a slate silver dial. You had a blue, sort of deep blue dial. You had a white grape dial, which was pretty cool, but I think the one that I really love is the red grape purple dial that they released to this watch. The dials are very similar. They have kind of like a sunburst finish to it, glossy, which allows it to pop and really captures light really nicely in different areas. So when you're inside, it looks very different than when you're wearing it outside. And so that was sort of like the first batch that they released in 2015. But they also released after these colors were released, they released a white dial and a black dial version of the Oyster Perpetual 39s in 2018, which I thought was an interesting move to do that after the fact. I think these would probably be more desirable to many more people. I think there are certain versions of this watch that were actually desirable by collectors. I think the sort of deep blue version of this watch was very desirable. You see them a ton. The red grape was sort of on the fence. I actually think it was under-purchased. And so I personally think that this was more of a rare version of this 114300. But going to having a white and black dial version of this watch was kind of the opposite way I would imagine that Rolex would approach many of their, how they release their watches. The watch has a cost-certified automatic Rolex caliber 3132 movement, which was also put in their Explorer models at that time, and so you're getting everything that you want from this watch. So I actually think that this reference was underappreciated during the time that it was in production, and really only became popular or got its fame once Rolex actually discontinued this model and released the 114300. excuse me, the 124300. So the candy pink and the turquoise, the sort of Tiffany blue and pink dial versions of these watches. And so I guess the thesis that I have that I kind of want to pass to you as someone who may be interested in watches is look for these little things in brands that make them that are abnormal in the larger line of watches that they may be producing. It could be the dial color, like these Rolexes, where Rolex really is a fairly conservative brand that sticks with what they know, what they've produced, what's proven to be extremely popular, and look for references that take a different turn, ones that use this pop of color to attract different types of buyers or expand their line in a different way. You can also, it goes beyond Rolex, right? It goes to other brands, and I think if you apply this sort of concept, it's a way of evaluating what might be the next hot watch. Now, I don't think that's not the mindset that you should have if you're collecting watches. You should buy something that you really love. But if that is something that's on your mind, look for those abnormalities in the lineups of people of the brands that you love and the watches that they release, because you could find a hidden gem in there where something that's abnormal but of very high quality can be enjoyed quite nicely and kind of follow the mindset of where the brand is sort of going. As I always say, this isn't investment advice. This is just me thinking about, different ways of collecting and identifying these sort of quirky watches within a brand that still hold true to their values is a way that you could think about collecting. I think there are many vintage collectors who look for these abnormal watches that sort of are on the quirkier side, that have a unique way of displaying what the company is about. I think the biggest thing that you have to concentrate on is, sure, I'm going to find something that's a little bit abnormal, but ensure that it has the quality that goes the full length, that can go the full distance in representing the brand and what they're capable of doing. So with the 114300, for example, sure, they had different dial colors. It's very, very ostentatious, very obvious to the eye that this is something a little bit different than what they typically release. But what they didn't do is completely change the Oyster Perpetual design. They didn't completely change the way that their case is constructed, or the caliber of movement that is used in the watch, or the construction of the bracelet, or those types of things. It stays true to having a cost-certified movement that's well-tested and well-respected by many collectors. They kept the original design elements of this watch, which can make it attractive to a wider audience, but has that little edge, that little different color, or that little variation in a bezel. If you're thinking about the Rolex, if you're thinking about the Rainbow Daytonas, like that's the piece that I think you have to consider as well. Quality watches from a brand that you love, but has that extra little quirk. And I think you can create a very interesting collection through that sort of concept. What's also really important is making sure that the watch isn't going to dilute the origins of where it came from. So you could very easily Rolex could have very easily created a completely let's just say a 180 from what the Oyster Perpetual really truly is, and I think it would have destroyed the brand in some way. And I don't know. I think you can form a collection where these concepts are applied pretty nicely. Anyway, I'll cover a couple of watches next time on the podcast from all of the watch auctions that are going to be taking place over the next couple of weeks. As you know, I'm super into participating and watching these auctions, so Stay tuned for my coverage on that. I'll probably discuss some of my favorite watches from each of the auctions. I'll leave a link in the show notes to where we've covered some of these watches that we've discussed. The 124300 specifically, I'll put that in the show notes, so you can take a look at that. If you are new to Life from the Wrist podcast, be sure to follow us if you like watches, and share this with a friend who might be interested in listening to a watch podcast. If you haven't seen our YouTube channel or our website, be sure to head over there. There'll be links in the show notes to all of our social media pages, our website, and our YouTube channel. So be sure to head over if you want some more interesting information about watches. If you are feeling generous and wouldn't mind rating this podcast, really does help me out. With that said, guys, thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and until next time.